Welcome everyone as you're joining our webinar. We're going to give it another minute or two to let people come in before we officially start. Again, this is a World Oregon webinar on higher ed in the time of COVID-19. Just give us another minute or two to get everyone in. Hello, this is Derrick Olsen, the President of World Oregon. I'm going to officially start today's webinar on higher ed in the age of COVID-19, focusing on the international implications and how we maintain positive ties with students, faculty, and institutions internationally through all these challenges. For those of you who have not been on a World Oregon Zoom program before, this is a Zoom webinar where only the panelists and myself, the moderator, will have their video and audio on. All participants will be muted with their video off, and you can ask questions in the Q&A function at the, for most of you, depending on your setup, the bottom of your screen. Depending on what device you're using, it might be the top of your screen. We will also be posting some things in the chat session function where we'll have links to information we might discuss. I will just say a few opening words. Each of our panelists will have an opening statement, and then we'll start a round robin of questions and then start building in questions from the audience. So I encourage you to think about your questions and to pose them here. And while anything on higher ed is fine, we're trying to focus today's conversation about the international aspects of it, given that that's our organization. So first, a big thanks and welcome to our three panelists. We have Dr. Wiewel, who's the president of Lewis and Clark College. Dr. Kendra Sharp, the Senior Advisor to the Provost for International Affairs at Oregon State University, and Dr. Dennis Galvan, who's the Dean and Vice Provost in the Division of Global Engagement at the University of Oregon. All three of them serve on World Oregon's Board of Trustees, and we have very strong partnerships with all three institutions, along with a number of other public and private higher ed organizations in Oregon and Southwest Washington. And we asked the three of them to join us today to give their perspectives from the different types of campuses and student bodies and faculty focus areas in these three great institutions of higher learning. I would just note, as a parent of a college student myself who just finished a Zoom spring semester, I understand and sympathize both with the students and faculty administrators during this challenging time. So it's with great interest. I look forward to having a robust, informal discussion about COVID-19, higher ed, and international connections. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton to Dr. Wiewel, who's going to talk about his perspective on things. Then next will be Dr. Sharp, and then Dr. Galvan, and then we'll go into more of an interactive discussion. Vim.
Great. Thank you, Derrick, and thank you to everybody out in Radio Land there who we can't see for joining us for this conversation. You know, this is a topic of sort of how does this crisis affect the international aspects of higher education, either because of students that come or now maybe not coming, students that go abroad, faculty that are either coming as visitors or that might otherwise have gone to work abroad. It's a very important topic. It's very important to me personally. I was born and raised in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and first came to the United States with an organization called American Field Service, and that allowed me to spend a year living with a family in suburban New York and attending the last year of high school there. And it was absolutely unconditionally the most transformational experience of my life. So I've always been a very strong believer in the value of getting out of your own culture and spending time in a totally different culture as a way not just to learn about that culture, but also to learn about your own by contrast, and of course, ultimately to learn about yourself. I went back and did my undergrad and master's studies in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and then went up, moving back to the United States, where I've lived continuously for over 40 years now. But I have loved in all the places where I've worked to be able to promote an international focus. And that works out in different ways in different institutions. In some of the large public institutions, I spent 9 years at Portland State University as president. There was a limit on how many students could go and study abroad because of financial reasons, work reasons, and so on. I'm now at Lewis and Clark College, where study abroad particularly has been an absolutely essential element of our international focus. About 60 to 65% of our undergrads go and study abroad for at least a semester. Many of them spend time living with their family or sometimes living in student housing and studying abroad. In addition to that, of course, we do get international students, but it's a modest number. It's only about 5% of our student population, so it's about 100 undergraduates at any one time. And then we also have an academic English program, which gets students for a shorter period. And in the law school, we have a Masters of Law program that attracts a certain number of international students. We also do have a very interesting group that we called Third Culture Kids, which is quite large, which are Americans who, however, largely grew up abroad and are now coming to Lewis and Clark to study. And we have a bit of a specialty in attracting them. All of these groups that I've mentioned are being affected, and we expect will be affected in the next year by the pandemic. And we'll go into more detail in a variety of ways in how that plays out, what we're trying to do to mitigate it as much as possible. Like most other universities and colleges, we are absolutely committed to having classes online, in person this fall, but also simultaneously be fully prepared to deliver online, either in case we fully need to go there if things get worse again, or to simultaneously deliver both ways because some students may need to go into isolation for a shorter period. So we're going to have this hybrid delivery method, but we certainly expect and hope to get a lot of international students back. And we do hope to send students abroad as well, but we'll get into some of the details of that later. Let me turn it to my colleague, Kendra Sharp, to talk more about what's happening at Oregon State University. I do need to note that I'm wearing an orange tie because that's the Lewis and Clark color, and we picked it, I think, in 1872, which was several years before Oregon State picked orange.
Thank you so much. I actually thought you were wearing the orange tie for the Netherlands.
Both.
So, yes. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today on this webinar for World Oregon. I am the Senior Advisor to the Provost for International Affairs at Oregon State University, so our Senior International Officer. And my responsibilities are the strategy and coordination of our global activities across all of the institution. So Oregon State is, of course, a large land grant, public land grant institution in the state of Oregon. And that the land grant mission is very much a part of our core. And I'm just going to read to you for a minute our mission in our current strategic plan, that we are a land grant institution committed to teaching, research, outreach, and engagement. And we promote economic, social, cultural, and environmental progress for the people of Oregon, the nation, and the world. And I read that to just really represent how much global impact and global activity is a part of our entire institution. We also pride ourselves on preparing graduates to work in an increasingly globalized and diverse workplace and society. So it's very important for our students to have the experiences, to have an opportunity to work with diverse sets of students and to have opportunities such as study abroad or research abroad. So with COVID-19, obviously all of the international travel got shut down very quickly. We had many of our study abroad students did return to the US, not all, some did decide to stay where they were, recognizing that they may not be able to travel for some time after the travel closures. And then our international students also, we have about 11% international students. which is a little over 3,000. And when COVID-19 started happening and the travel restrictions went into place, they were faced with a very difficult decision as to whether or not to remain in the US or to return to their home country. And there's so much uncertainty around returning to their home country, what the travel restrictions will be coming back, when they will be able to come back, that this was really a difficult decision. Oregon State made a very intentional decision to keep our university housing and dining services open, not just for the international students, but because we recognize that not all students were able to go home to shelter in place or to under the stay-at-home order. And we have had, so a number of our international students have remained there, and then they are also able to stay in our housing over the summer if they were enrolled in the spring, even if they're not enrolled in the summer. So we've made some really intentional decisions to try to help our international students to continue their academic programs. We're very committed to making sure that they can continue their academic programs, whether they're in the US or return to their home country. So just very quickly, we know that about somewhere between 10 and 20% of our international students are continuing their academic program from their home country. Many of them, though, decided to stay in the US. We are planning to resume in-person teaching in late summer and fall, obviously in accordance with the executive orders and the state's opening and resumption of activity guidelines. We have, and Dennis can talk about this too, but Oregon State has been working with the other public institutions in the state to really closely coordinate our resumption plans. And again, we've been in very close contact with the Higher Education Commission of Oregon, all of our institutions, all of our presidents, all of our provosts, and leadership have been in contact with the other public institutions. So we are planning on resuming in person as much as possible in the fall. But again, like Dr. Wiewel said, we plan on having the option for remote delivery, because we know that some students will be having to isolate, or there may be international students continuing. We also have a very strong eCampus program, and that is helping to support our students in continuing their academic program. I think I'll leave it at that for now, and then we can get into more details with questions.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining this World Oregon webinar. Thanks to World Oregon and my colleagues Kendra and Wim for joining us. It's a pleasure to talk to you from Eugene about how COVID-19 is affecting higher education, particularly the international component of what we do. At the University of Oregon, we are deeply committed to the idea that a world-class university must be a globally engaged university. And that translates, just like it does up the road in Corvallis and in Portland, into making sure that our students have real live contact with global experiences from study abroad and international internships. We send about 28% of our entire student body on a global engagement credit-bearing experience. And that's a little better than the American Association of Universities, public universities, which send about 26%. We are, like Oregon State, about the same percent, 10, 11% international students. They are a vital resource in making sure that our students here on campus get a global experience right here in their classrooms, in their labs, in their dorms, by getting to know and making friends with people from all around the world. And this is integral to my own personal story. My father is from Argentina. I've lived abroad and done research in West Africa and Indonesia for the last 30 years. And it's a real, for me, it's a powerfully transformative thing to watch as an educator, to see a young person of 19, 20 years old make their first foray into the world and then come back more confident, more self-aware, more able to navigate the cross-cultural experiences that this world that they're going to inherit so desperately need. And they need the skills to address questions like climate change and trade and immigration, and not to mention global pandemics. So speaking of the moment, let me just share a couple of things that we're doing at the University of Oregon to try and quickly adapt to the new circumstances. We think higher education is going to change, and we're trying to get ready for that change. And we're setting up elements of adaptation for the moment that I think will stay with us for a long time. So I'm going to quickly screen share just a couple of illustrations, so bear with me. Hope you all can see the multilingual inclusion poster. So the multilingual inclusion poster was a very first step. We recognize that on our campus and in our community, we're trying to all think of this as something that we get through together. But our international students, particularly from China and from East Asia in general, I think really felt like they needed an extra an extra element of support. So we pushed this out across campus, across Eugene. We did an Oregon Live homepage takeover on March 31st. The message was developed by our Chinese students and then translated into the 17 other languages you see here. We've also changed the way we do outreach to our international students. We've ramped up engagement on WeChat, which is the main social media platform used in China. So most of our international students are on a new WeChat group and get a daily update from us every evening about what's going on campus. And you can see in the upper right box, there's a certain level of candor that they are able to share that we were not hearing before. And partly this is because WeChat allows them to not use their own name, to use avatars to present themselves. So we're getting new kinds of feedback that we think really helps us address the needs of international students as they go through this difficult time. And then we're doing the same thing in other social media platforms popular outside of China, like WhatsApp and Line, which is widely used in Japan. And then finally, let me share another feature of what we're doing. I think you can see the No Passport Needed page. So we have retooled our study abroad programs and our international internships to go remote this summer. And the way this works is you don't need a passport to go. It's much more affordable, and we can continue to connect you to the world. I'll play a very short video that introduces this visually in a way that's better than I can probably do with words. Let's see if I can make that bigger.
Dennis, might need to shift your screen.
So much to learn about the world of school.
We learn a lot about the UK from its theatre.
Hola, vamos a empezar.
And it may have not come through, so if not, I apologize for that. But the general idea is that students, instead of going on travel-based study abroad, they can have a remote experience with local experts. They can have remote engagement with a homestay family who they can get to know before they travel. They can do remote excursions. They can do remote internships for companies that they might end up working for in the future. So we're trying to take advantage of the opportunity of the moment to give more students the chance to have the beginning of a global education experience, and that will eventually be followed up by travel. And finally, the last thing I want to mention, we're working with other partner universities, Oregon State is one of them, to think about getting students involved right away in the immediate work of addressing the coronavirus crisis, particularly contact tracing. So with a number of other universities on the West Coast and through the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, we're creating a curricular path for students to study public health responses to coronavirus, and for some of them to move into internships working with the Oregon Health Authority and our local county public health authorities to actually train to become contact tracers. So this is a way that A, we hope to get students inspired to continue their educations by being part of the solution, and B, we'll do this in a way that connects them to other students in other countries who are doing the same kind of work. So we leverage the moment to create new forms of global connection that speak directly to the crisis. And in the Q&A, I can say more about our plans to, in coordination with Oregon State, to open in the fall and anything else you'd like to talk about. So thank you again.
Great, thanks Dennis, Kendra, and Vim for your opening statements and sharing all that great information. And Dennis, yeah, why don't we dive in there and we start with Dennis and then go to Kendra and Vim to talk a little bit about as you look to this fall. I know someone's going to ask this in Q&A, so let's dive in, especially with international students and some of the challenges, both as Kendra mentioned with the international travel, but also with immigration, with the some of the draconian moves by the current administration. If you could talk a little bit about that and how that impacts in a way that's a little bit more complicated than just, you know, a student in Oregon going to school this fall.
Absolutely. So, we are, we plan, just like Oregon State, to go into a hybrid mode in the fall where we are open and but in a way that's safe. So there won't be large lecture classes, for example. They'll be remote, and all of this is highly contingent on the certification with the state that we can safely open. So that's where the contact tracing and the testing comes in. For international students, this is especially tricky, right? We, just like Oregon State, we're pretty sure about 28% of our international students went home to their home countries during the spring. But that leaves a large chunk of them here. Many of them would really like to go home for the summer to see their families. Everyone is concerned that what happens if I go home? What happens if I'm already home and I can't get back into the US in September or August, depending on our start date? So what we're starting to plan on is no visa needed international enrollment. So a academic year 2021, where a student who is outside the United States can enroll in a combination of remote programs, sometimes internships for credit in their home country. We have a lot of these in China, for example, and eventually may come to campus at a later date, say in the winter quarter or the spring quarter. We might also offer these students the opportunity to enroll for credit in study abroad opportunities that we have in third countries that may become open. So for example, a student who is in China may end up going to our exchange partner university in Korea or Singapore, take credits there that count towards their degree. So we're trying to use all the tools of global mobility to address the needs of the international students who can't get into the US.
Thanks, Dennis. Vim or Kendra, you want to jump in?
Kendra, you want to go ahead, please?
Sure. I mean, much like Dennis, so we are really looking at how we can have international students. Continuing international students can continue to do their studies from abroad in the fall. And then we are also looking at how to onboard our new international students in the fall through eCampus or some combination of remote learning and eCampus so that they can actually start their academic program. We hope that they would be able to get here by January. That things are very much uncertain, so we are looking at ways that we can have those plans in place beyond just the fall. We would usually have about 800 new international students coming to the university. So this is, yeah, it has a pretty significant impact. And so far, the intentions, when we have surveyed students who are applying, students who are enrolling, the intentions seem pretty good that they will be starting even from their home country.
Yeah, one of our advantages, of course, as a small liberal arts college is that the numbers are considerably smaller. So we're able to customize the approach for students. It's further helped by the fact that most of our international students actually are recruited from a pretty small number of select high schools called the United World Colleges. There are 17 of them around the world. And they themselves have a very international student body. They're located really all over the world. And most of our international students are recruited from them. So it's a small group that we can work with and figure out what is the best approach for any one of them. We certainly, of course, since so much of what makes Lewis and Clark special is the residential college experience, we very much hope that, as many of them as possible will in fact come. Just like many of them, in fact, are staying, just like Dennis and Kendra were saying, while we had most of our residential students go home in the middle of March, about 150 students, many of them international students, although a good number of domestic students as well, stayed on campus. And we will have about 40, and I think that's almost only international students staying on campus this summer because it's just not practicable, and they come from about 20 different countries. I think they were from all over the place, where either they literally cannot go because there are no flights or they're not allowed to, or they just feel that it's not safe and they want to stay here. We are concerned also, this hasn't come up specifically, about the international students who have graduated and who can't return to their own countries right now. They have going to have a visa problem. The current federal policies, as you know, are not very friendly towards people staying, to people getting the optional practical training that allowed many of them to take jobs. A lot of companies aren't hiring, of course. So we are trying to figure out, again, in a very individualized way, some of them may be able to continue studying. We're trying to make accommodations to continue to be as hospitable to these students that have been with us for 4 years, as well as worrying about the ones that we hope will come in new, either in August or otherwise in January. We are a member, as I suspect my colleagues are, of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration, which is an alliance of, I don't know, must be probably over 100 higher education institutions in the United States that frankly lobbies and works with legislators to try to bring to the fore and to the attention of legislators the challenges that people have with immigration issues, visa issues, study issues, to try to get good public policies that allow us to go forward. Because, you know, as we've all been saying, you know, this is such an important part of our institutions and of our educational programs. Frankly, for Lewis and Clark, it has not been a huge part of our financial situation. I know for some of the institutions that has really become big and they rely heavily, schools like University of Southern California or NYU, where huge percentages of the students are international. For us, it's really, it's a part of who we are as an institution that cares about a global approach and having all students be exposed to a very diverse student body. So we will continue to do what we can to make it possible for international students to come to campus. And then the other question is study abroad. We'll get back to that in a minute, I'm sure.
Derrick, can I make just an additional comment? So I think, you know, much like, well, Dennis and Vim have also talked about this, is, you know, I think all of our higher education institutions are looking at how we can adapt to this situation that may make us stronger in the future. So we have, for example, our public-private partnership into OSU, which is a partnership that we have with the Into Global Corporation to recruit. It's a large network around the globe to recruit international students. And one thing is we've really accelerated some of their efforts along with our eCampus to really put more of our content online. And I think that's something that will continue well into the future. So things like more students will be able to start remotely in the future, not just because of coronavirus, but maybe because they're interested in trying out Oregon State, they'd like to start, they're not sure they want to come to the US quite yet, but that may be a pathway for them in the future. So I think this is something that's really positive, is we're all looking at what are the opportunities here to adapt and be more global in the future.
Great. I'm going to ask a couple more questions before we start incorporating audience questions. So I'll encourage you, we got one or two in the Q&A function, but I encourage you to start entering those questions in, and Program Director Tim DeRoche will jump in a little bit with some of those questions. And while we're waiting for those, wanted to throw it back to you, Vim. Kendra and Dennis talked about some of the coordination between public universities in the States about reopening in the fall. I know that Lewis and Clark is a member of the Oregon Alliance of Independent Colleges and Universities. Do you have a sense of what some of the other private colleges and universities are looking, and is it similar to Lewis and Clark as far as the approach they're planning for the fall, or is it really depend on the campus?
Yeah, well, first of all, of course, this coordination approach is for all of higher education. It is being pulled together by the Higher Education Coordinating Council. That's what they do, they coordinate. And the public universities have been putting together stuff. The private universities through the Oregon Alliance of Independent Colleges and Universities have been putting together suggested protocols for what we would do if we're in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. And as you know, most counties in Oregon now are in phase 1. Multnomah County is not yet. We fully hope and expect that by August, we will be in phase 2 in Multnomah County as well, and really in all of the state at least, so that we can operate, I hardly would want to say somewhat normally, but where you can in fact have in-person classes. You pretty much need to be in phase 2 to be able to have groups of up to 50. Most of our classes are around 20. But the phase 1 limitation is like 10 people, so that really makes it very hard. Even with that, there's a bit of a sidebar, but like the other schools, we'll all be needing to refigure our classrooms and figure out what the protocols are in terms of testing students when they first come in, having people maybe self-isolate for a period. Do students wear masks? Do we create residential bubbles, that within which people are essentially like a family? So there'll be all kinds of protocols in place. And, when you think about collectively what higher education and really the country as a whole has done in just the last 2.5 months, I remind my colleagues that, it is only May 20th. We still do have about 3 months to work out all the details. We don't have to have it all done tomorrow. We just need to know what needs to be done. And that goes for the planning of my other colleague institutions. I think the other private institutions are pretty much doing the same things we are, Derrick. I don't think for any of them, the international component is as large as it is for OSU and U of O, because remember, a lot of international students come to graduate programs. So for the liberal arts colleges, which are primarily undergraduate, the percentages are always lower. We don't have and most of us do not have engineering programs, which is another area. I know that at Portland State, we had a lot of undergraduate engineering programs from abroad. So again, the numbers are smaller, but they're not insignificant. I know for my colleagues at Pacific, they're significant in some of the professional fields they have. But we're all wrestling with this same question. Again, like Kendra is saying, we all know that we will have to be delivering our education both ways this fall, no matter what the situation is. Well, let's put it this way. We'll be in person and online. If we're only online, that's all we're doing, but we don't expect that. And it will allow us that flexibility in a way that we now don't have. For some of us, ultimately being in person is the hallmark, and that's what we're about. Now, we certainly tell people that having an online education with a group of 12 or 14 students is very different than a massive open online course with hundreds or a lecture with even 50 or 75. But ultimately, we aim to all be in person and be able to provide that education for everyone.
Thanks, Vim. And if I could ask Dennis briefly, and then Tim, maybe you could jump in with some of the audience questions. Dennis, could you touch on a little bit faculty exchanges and how they're affected? I mean, through the Fulbright program, which is one of the leading U.S. exchange programs through faculty or postgraduate students, but also other types of exchange programs. Maybe you could touch a little bit on how that is affected in addition to students.
Sure, absolutely. So, the steady flow of faculty through the Fulbright program both ways, through the European Union has something called the Erasmus Plus program, which is very similar to Fulbright. So of course, as Vim pointed out, in the last 2.5, 3 months, this all came to a quick halt. What we're starting to see as faculty plan for fall and into the following year is sort of tentative forays into trying to figure out, will it be possible for me to go on my Fulbright sabbatical in France, or for us to receive a Fulbright language teaching associate here? So the short answer is that there seem to be the programs are still alive. The programs are still hoping to finance and support mobility, and the questions are largely simply about safety. So the world is still at a CDC level 3, State Department level 4 warning, which essentially says no travel. One of the things we're looking at is to get a little more granular in terms of understanding country by country where a faculty member might go to or seek to come from, can we get a more specific analysis of case levels, of the degree to which the contagion is declining or increasing in specific locations, specific countries, even specific cities, hospital beds, availability of personal protective equipment, so that we may end up making assessments about where people go that are based on very specific information on the locations. And I, of course, one of the big questions for any receiving country for a US faculty member is, do they want to have someone come from this country to their location? I heard today that New Zealand is shutting down for a year inbound travel, which makes perfect sense if you're in New Zealand. So we're going to be monitoring this on a case-by-case basis. What I'm very encouraged by, is that my faculty colleagues remain very motivated and reasonable, cautious, cognizant of the risks, but motivated to continue these kind of connections, which in many fields are the absolute lifeblood of top research.
If I may, Derrick, I wanted to pick up on that topic also in regard to study abroad. It's the same thing, that we will be looking at on a very country-specific basis. Again, we need to, of course, as long as the level 4 and level 3, State Department warnings are in place, we can't do anything. But assuming that gets lifted, but it will be on a country-by-country basis. We have 2 faculty-led trips planned for the fall, and we'll see what those countries are like at that time. And then we have a lot of students going individually to any number of countries for language training and other things, and that would be quite varied. We will make a decision on that fairly soon, because of course these are things for which people do need to plan ahead. So in the not too distant future, we may have to make that decision and either go ahead or just say we postpone some of these study abroad faculty-led trips to the spring semester.
So Derrick, this is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs for World Oregon. I'm going to jump in here because we have a question. It's Graham Morris from Japan America Society. It's related to both of what Vim and Dennis just talked about. Do you think it makes more sense to focus on programming excellence and hope to attract students worldwide, or, considering everything right now, to focus on specific countries, as you alluded to, for very different reasons which may exist? And should Oregon as a state be focused on specific countries in business? And as he points out, if yes, where? My bias is obvious. Thank you, Graham.
Well, we certainly would not be in favor of the state dictating which countries we should be working with. As I mentioned, in terms of us attracting international students, we have focused on these United World Colleges, but they themselves have students from literally all over the world. So the specific students could come from anywhere, from Pakistan to any of the stands in former Soviet Union to Latin America, African countries. And then there are some individual students who also come from Japan and South Korea and other places. So, but yeah, we focused it, so you might say we focused it sectorally rather than on any particular country. Many other colleges and universities are focused on specific countries, because of reasons of history, or Dennis, I'm sure you see this, because faculty have been doing research in those countries and have strong connections. Often that's really how a whole pipeline comes about. It's almost random. It's because somebody back in 1970 had a big research program in Indonesia or wherever it may be. So institutions will make decisions, I think, based on their resources, where they can be most effective.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick and then turn it maybe to Kendra. Totally agree that there are layers to this question. It's a very, very nuanced question. Thank you, Graham, for it. Yeah, at the university institutional level, we of course want to factor in kind of a mosaic of concerns. Where do the faculty have research partners? Where do we have strong alumni bases? So the University of Oregon has an amazing alumni base in Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, because those were big sending countries in the 1980s. And where do we see student interest in our areas of specialty, in our areas of expertise? So here at the University of Oregon, as we roll out biomedical engineering in the next few years, we know we're going to be in a different place in India than we were before. So at a university level, it's nuanced, and we develop strategies that evolve country by country. At a state level, of course, we are sitting here on the Pacific Rim, and to my mind, if we think about the next 50 years, the state of Oregon has a great deal to do with the Western Pacific, with the other side of the Pacific, perhaps more so than it has to do with other parts of the United States. And so to me, our future lies as a state in thinking about trade, economic exchange, cultural exchange, building up personal networks of trust with folks across the Pacific Rim, which is why for me, the idea that we could build a student core for contact tracing that gets young people today linked up to young people in Korea or in China doing the same work, if we can build that, that's going to be an investment in future resilience for that entire generation. So they have somebody to talk to in the next pandemic or the next global crisis, somebody they know and trust. And that's a global asset that I think is incredibly important for the state of Oregon.
Kendra, anything to add?
Really just, I think Dennis summed it up very nicely, that where our institutional partnerships are really driven by institutional strengths, by where we have relationships, where we have alumni bases, where we have networks. And that's somewhat different than state priorities. But we really are focusing on what matches with our strengths, what makes sense at this time in terms of our resources and markets.
So we've got a question from an anonymous attendee. That's their name, anonymous attendee. They ask, PSU and U of O international student intake numbers in their intensive English language programs have plummeted 90% over the past 4 years, even prior to COVID. Is this reflected elsewhere in Oregon? And what are the numbers doing more widely around the US? Have we lost our competitiveness, and what does this say about our priorities?
This is Derek. Maybe I can jump in here first and share something from the Institute of International Education, IIE Open Doors report. So I posted this in the chat. I'm going to share my screen here briefly, which is the IIE report for Oregon. And you'll notice this is for 2019. And there was a drop last year from 2018. The top sending countries are China, India, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and South Korea overall. And as you note, two of our panelists, OSU and U of O, are the top two in overall numbers, with PSU and then several of the community colleges after that. I would note, just as someone who used to work for the U.S. Department of State, that a lot of this can be also wrapped up into visa aspects as well with the intensive English language. I would encourage those who are interested to take a look at this IIE report. There's one for the whole United States or other states you're interested in. I'll stop there and throw it to the panelists if they want to dive in more specifics about some of the ups and downs in either specific programs or countries of sending countries of origin.
Thanks, Derek. Great context.
Well, of course, the visa challenges have been huge. In my last year at Portland State University, I traveled to Japan, India, and Korea to really talk to international students and their families. And this was in early 2017, right after the 2016 election. And, it was just palpable that people both were experiencing real problems and they were even more worried about future problems. Not a new thing, because even in 2009 and 10, when I traveled to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia was experiencing huge visa problems. So in that sense, this problem has been with us for a long time. It's been almost amazing that the total number of international students continued to go up until, I don't know, 2 years ago, I forget exactly, 3 years ago, even though, yes, the students in the intensive English programs was going down, I think, in most institutions. Perhaps in part that it was just harder to get visas for those programs. Dennis and Kendra, you probably have a better sense of that than I do.
Yeah, I would, on the intensive English programs, I think as many on the call recognize, these are kind of boom and bust business. They tend to go through strong years of interest, and then they go through declining interest. We were in a declining phase nationally, as I understand it, from the American English Institute here at the University of Oregon, prior to 2016, prior to the recent administration. And sometimes this is driven by the value of the dollar. Sometimes it's driven by the world price of oil. Many of our intensive English programs were coming from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Gulf. Oil prices were going up and down in that period. So no question that things got much worse in the last couple of years because of immigration issues. Have we lost, I see in the question, have we lost our competitiveness in terms of intensive English programs? In a way, you might say we yielded it, because what happened with 2016-17 with the current federal regime in Washington, we now face much stiffer competition from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom for the same students. And they are able, in significant ways, to provide an equivalent educational experience, both in intensive English and in higher ed, at sometimes much lower cost. So we will have to work our way back into that market. And I know that Oregon State is way ahead of us in terms of using public-private partnerships to think about how to do that. And I think it's probably made the landscape a little less volatile up in Corvallis.
Yeah, I'll just add, I'll add briefly that we recognize that, for example, in India, that the intensive English isn't the program that they're looking for. So really, I mean, you're talking about Indian students who already have very strong English language skills. It's a question of what does Oregon State have that appeals to those students? And so that's something that we're very sensitive to, and I think really responding to in terms of competitiveness. I think we do need to just be able to respond to what are the needs, what are the interests in coming to the US for study, and how does that mesh with our institutional strengths?
So here's a question from Jen. Given much of the activity for study abroad is self-funded in nature, how do we advocate for a different funding model that provides for sustainability during a time that we'll see reduced to zero revenue as a result of current travel restrictions?
That's a familiar question from a familiar name. Hi, Jen. Maybe I'll just jump in really quickly, since we run a pretty big study abroad operation here with about 1,300 students going outbound through Global Education Oregon. We recognize very fully what you're talking about, Jen, in terms of the fact that we're gonna enter a drought year for study abroad revenue. There's no question. We don't know when travel will be possible again. Maybe it'll be January, maybe it'll be April. Worst case scenario, I hope it's no later than summer 21. And the way we're thinking about this here is that the skill set associated with building global education programming, the curricular part, the co-curricular part, the experience on the ground, that's a skill set that during this difficult year, we hope to be able to reorient towards programs that now allow any student, particularly those students who may be overseas and can't come into the US, to have some kind of connective experience, right? And the skill set around building study abroad can, to my mind, be transposed onto much richer versions of remote education than just listening to a talking head like me yakking away at you. Like, not to say that a webinar isn't a great experience, I think this one is, but what we want to do is go beyond the rooms that we're all sitting in and connect to people in places that we would have visited. And so that's actually, the more all of our education is remote, the more we can bring the spirit of study abroad, of real connection to people in places like remote homestay and remote excursions, into everybody's classrooms. And so our hope here at U of O is that we'll survive this drought year in study abroad by taking excellent staff in study abroad and helping them enhance remote education across the entire curriculum.
Yeah, we've talked about this at Lewis and Clark. I have to say, perhaps I'm biased because of my own experience that, you can do a lot of stuff remote, and of course you can have the content of the curriculum in a whole variety of ways. But to me, there is nothing like the actual experience of being there, of feeling like a fool because you can't think of the right word in the language where you are. Just seeing the many aspects of life that are different, that are not just captured in a curriculum. So now the other thing is that for us, study abroad is a costly thing. We, as an institution, we pay a lot of money for these programs. We send out, for most of them, we send our faculty abroad with a group, and we work with partners, and it's very expensive. So actually, if we don't do it this fall, we'll actually save money. But this is an important part of the experience, so we would rather spend the money and have it. So yeah, we may come up with alternatives, but our goal and focus is going to be to, as quickly as possible, to give people that fully immersive experience that really is what makes something life-changing rather than just knowledge enhancing.
Kendra, anything to add to that?
No, I think I'm sensitive to time, so why don't we go ahead and take the next question?
Well, one of the things that came up, and I think a few of you have touched on it, Fulbright. So, I mean, are there students who have been given grants to study or teach English, or faculty to conduct research abroad? Are those on hold? Are they suspended? And what do we think is going to become of Fulbright going forward?
So I can just mention that this year, yes, if we had faculty abroad, that those programs were suspended, and our faculty, it was just really heartbreaking to see that they had to leave their Fulbright year and come home. Actually, in several cases, they rented out their houses because they planned to be away. There was a lot of this difficult shuffling going on. I do think that the Fulbright program will come back. It just may take a little while, and we do still have some Fulbright scholars here at Oregon State.
And I'll jump in here. I just would note, from World Oregon perspective, whenever we see the federal budget being discussed at the for international exchanges, which is usually a push-pull between Congress and the White House, on some of the more draconian proposals was to eliminate virtually all exchange programs except for Fulbright. I think mainly because Fulbright has such a resonance, and also it is often benefiting American citizens, American teachers directly. We, of course, would like to see the full range of programs funded that help exchanges both ways. But it is notable, I think, even for some of those who are very skeptical in some political camps about international exchange, recognize that Fulbright is kind of sacrosanct. So I'm hopeful that, much like as Vim and Dennis were talking, if we can get through some of this, the question is how much is adapting and how much is changing for the future. I did post, by the way, in the chat, the link to Dennis's, the video from U of O and No Passport Needed, since we had some technical difficulties on that. Tim, do you have another question from the audience?
You know what, we're running up on our time. So I think I'm gonna pass it back to you. And I just wanna thank all the panelists for joining us on what is, it's an important question for Oregon, for the world, and how we go forward, so.
Well, thanks, Tim. And I would just note that, as I was mentioning, World Oregon works very closely with all three of these institutions, as well as many others in Oregon and Southwest Washington, with our international visitors. And unfortunately, our international visitor program is currently suspended through the State Department until the end of July because of COVID-19 concerns. We're hopeful at some point that will return. We're doing some tentative virtual exchanges, first with youth and later with adults. But many of these international visitors have some of their most impactful experiences, as Vim was mentioning, having face-to-face one-on-ones with experts, whether that's students or faculty on different campuses throughout the state. And so that's something that we work closely with universities on, and we hope to do. Another thing that I find interesting as we go through this challenge of remote learning is There are a number of countries, as was pointed out to me today, that Zoom is not allowed to operate because of either the government or certain internet service providers in especially authoritarian countries. They see that as a threat. And so that will be interesting as, World Oregon works with international visitor alumni, or colleges and universities work with students, without a virtual private network. There will be some challenges for some students using, whether it's Zoom or another type of a platform. There will be some restrictions on that. Before we wrap it up, finally, just see if there's any final words or comments that any of the panelists would like to make before I close this out.
Derrick, I'd just like to thank you for having us all today. I appreciate the comments of my colleagues. There are a lot of similar issues and similar responses that are coming from these different institutions. So I'd just like to thank the audience and thank World Oregon for having this panel today.
Yeah, likewise, and just to add that, many of these challenges that are now really accentuated because of the crisis, had really already started both because of the political situation in 2016, and as Dennis pointed out, the increased competitiveness of other countries. The United States kind of had a unique niche with higher education that it was kind of amazing how long we were able to sustain that. But they do education pretty well in a lot of other countries now. Plus the fact that a lot of countries that used to send a lot of students here developed their own educational systems, of course, China being the main one. So it was always going to be a more competitive world, and this has just accelerated it by maybe a decade or half a decade.
And I would just add my words of sincere thanks to World Oregon and to the scores of people who joined us for this webinar. And I just want to echo Vim's point that while we are adapting and doing our best to make sure we retain connection during this difficult time, we all look forward to being able to engage the world face-to-face and in person, because there is no substitute. And we also look forward to being able to engage the world through World Oregon face-to-face and in person, again in Portland.
Well, thanks. And that's a great segue to just what I always like to do at the end of these virtual programs, is to highlight for our audience that we have more great programming coming up in the next couple of weeks. We have the part 3 of our Rising Up for Human Dignity film and discussion series tomorrow night. And then in early June, we have some neat programs. We've added some international trivia hosted by our young professionals, an Atlantic Council think tank scholar talking about COVID and planning and policy. That's June 3rd. And June 4th, actually my former boss at the State Department, who's now a diplomat in residence at Yale University, Francisco Palmieri, talking about COVID-19 with a focus on Latin America, where he has extensive experience. So look forward to having you join us for those. If you're not a World Oregon member, encourage you to consider becoming a member or donating to help us through these challenging times and produce programs like this. A huge thanks to all of our panelists and the tremendous work they do for our children and for our state in helping us connect with the world and become better educated. And we really appreciate all that you do. So thanks everyone, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.